I'm not on distribution from the Russian General Staff, the Stavka in Moscow. So I have to try and glean from lots of people that are on the ground over there in Europe, as well as some analysts here and in Great Britain, but mostly in Europe and Germany and elsewhere. And what emerges from this is the following kind of picture. I think it's very clear that when President Putin began this campaign, he fully expected that when he demonstrated that he was serious about eliminating the threat to Russia in eastern Ukraine, something which he had been talking about for a long time. This was over the last 8 years, was made very clear. He also expected that he would have a negotiating partner. He thought that not only would the Ukrainians want to negotiate, but he thought, I think, that Washington would be interested in negotiating an end to the fighting and the conflict. I don't think he appreciated the level of ideological commitment and hatred in support of a war with Russia, and our willingness to turn this proxy war into our war in all but name, using Ukrainian lives instead of American and NATO lives per se. So it took him a while to come to terms with that, and I think he eventually did, especially when Mr. Biden went over in April and made his speech about regime change and talked about other things. I think at that point they figured this is a waste of time. These people aren't interested in negotiating an end to the conflict. At that point, they took stock and they said, okay, we're going to strike back, but we're not going to strike back in piecemeal fashion. We're not going to launch a series of offensives to drive back the Ukrainians. What we're going to do is take what we had originally thought was Russian anyway, which of course is, the people that live there are Russians in those areas. Then we are going to build up for a major offensive. If they will not cooperate, if they will not recognize the legitimacy of our position, then we will launch it and we will terminate this conflict on our terms. Well, you got to keep in mind that this is a theater that's almost 800 miles deep and certainly 500-600 miles wide. It's a vast area that requires a lot of time to position forces, move forces. This applies to Ukrainians, it applies to the Russians. And now I think what we are on the verge of seeing is this major offensive. He may actually approach the Ukrainians one more time. And then if he has no success and no one will talk, I think he's going to unloose hell, frankly. And we're going to see a very different Russian military establishment doing things that, frankly, people like me and others thought they would do much earlier. But again, you know, the man did not want to kill civilians, contrary to what is said in the West. He didn't want to damage lots of infrastructure. His view was, we want to live with Ukrainians when this is over. So we want minimal damage. We want early talks and negotiations. It all failed. No longer matters. If there's no final willingness to talk, then I think we will see what I and others thought would happen early on, a massive, uninterrupted, devastating assault throughout the country.
And also, what do you think about the possibility of nuclear war?
Non-existent unless we employ a nuclear weapon. There is no evidence of the Russians preparing to use nuclear weapons whatsoever. No nuclear warheads in sight, nothing being moved forward, out of the question. Putin has repeatedly said, even though the West does not bother listening to the man, and that's one of our problems, that nuclear weapons are exclusively for retaliatory purposes. In other words, if we are struck with a nuclear weapon, we will retaliate. So the notion that he has any plans for that is ridiculous. Secondly, if he's ever used more than 20% of his ground force, and we haven't even looked at the Air Force and the rocket forces and everything else he has at his disposal, what makes anyone think that he would feel the need to use a nuclear weapon? I don't think he does. Today, the conventional armaments at his disposal, these warheads on these missiles and rockets, are so devastating and so precise, there's no longer a requirement for a nuclear warhead. Remember that originally nuclear warheads were developed by the Russians and ultimately by us because we wanted to be sure to destroy the enemy, and we did not have precision. So you needed a large blast area to be sure that you would actually hit something that mattered. That's been passé for years. And the Russians have said so in their doctrine. So the age of precision-guided munitions and space-based intelligence and instantaneous communications is with us. So that sort of thing is not needed. Now, what are we going to do? Well, we have people in Washington with loose tongues and, making dumb comments about limited nuclear war. I'm shocked when I hear it. I can't believe it. It's insane. And one of the things that I opposed, but I couldn't do anything about it, was that during the last year of the Trump administration, he signed a defense bill that authorized people to build so-called tactical nuclear weapons. And I know that President Trump was not comfortable with it, but he wasn't prepared to veto the whole bill. That's usually how these kinds of things are packaged. Make it impossible to veto the bill, because if you do, you're going to hurt all sorts of other programs and nobody wants to hurt them. I think it was a mistake. I think he should have. And one thing the Democrats have gotten right, I'm talking about the Democrats on the Hill in the House and the Senate, who've been sadly very silent on this matter, is there's no such thing as a limited nuclear war. I mean, the whole thing is just crazy. We'll launch a low-yield nuclear warhead of less than 5 kilotons. Don't worry, the other side will understand. Well, that's absurd. A nuclear detonation goes off in your backyard. You trigger something in eastern Ukraine where there's a Russian concentration with a tactical nuclear weapon. And what do they think in Moscow? Oh, my God, we better launch a first strike or we'll lose our arsenal. And what have you got? Armageddon. It's insane. It needs to stop. And, no one is exercising, in my judgment, proper restraint in this regard. Someone in the White House should say, forget it. It's not on the table, out of the question. We haven't heard that, though. And I know that if Trump were there, that's something he would definitely say.
Why do you think we haven't heard that? Why do you think they're not doing that?
There are people who think that they can bully Russia. I mean, this whole thing began because people were confident for the last 20 years that Russia was weak and Russia could be bullied into whatever we wanted them to do. And once we had established all these globalist ideologues who are in league with the neocons, who have been trying to use American military power for 30 years to effectively dominate the world, and you have the globalists who also want to make our financial system a permanent feature of life.